great to be with all of you today. I'm Eliza. I'm the Programs and Research Lead for the AI Labor and Economy program at Partnership on AI. And we're excited to launch our new report today, written by our collaborator, Kung Feng. And it's titled Workers Participating in Transparency, Addressing the Gap in AI Transparency on Labor. So first, I wanted to introduce our wonderful speakers today. We have Kung Feng, and Kung was a consultant at PAI, where he produced this paper as part of his capstone project at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He is currently a researcher at the UC Berkeley Labor Center's Technology and Work Program. And on our panel, we have Elizabeth Ann Watkins. She's a research scientist in the social science of AI at Intel Labs Intelligent Systems Research, and a member of Intel's Responsible AI Advisory Council. In her role, she drives strategy and execution of social science methods to amplify human potential and human AI collaboration. We also have Michelle Miller, who is the Director of Innovation at Harvard Law School's Center for Labor and a Just Economy, where she researches the impact of technologies on working class life. And then finally, we have Aiha Nguyen, who is the Program Director for the Labor Futures at Data and Society, where she guides research and engagement. She brings a practitioner's perspective to this role, having worked for over a decade in community and worker advocacy and organizing in Los Angeles. And now I will pass it over to Kung for him to share about his paper.
Hello, everybody. So I'm starting with workers participating in transparency. The first point I want to make is that the economic impacts of AI on jobs and workers have been gaining widespread and sometimes sensational attention, which provokes the central question of this paper. Are workers who are so clearly impacted by AI also visible in the efforts to document AI impacts and practice safe and responsible AI? And if workers are not visible, how might we change that? So first, transparency. Transparency is a cornerstone of responsible AI in principle and in practice. It's the most widely cited responsible AI principle. Various surveys of principal statements find that 87% to 94% of principal statements include transparency. These include principal statements by Google, by Microsoft, IBM, and the IEEE. Transparency is also a well-established and developed practice with multiple examples in AI industry and research, such as data statements, data sheets for data sets, fact sheets, model cards, and system cards. Now, if we look in the popular media, we find a lot of dramatic headlines about AI's labor impacts. We have words like tsunami, job apocalypse, bloodbath. But if we look back in the transparency realm, there isn't an attention to labor. Transparency is one of the few principles that AI research and industry agrees upon and practices to ensure safe and responsible AI, yet workers are largely missing. Let's take a look at the landscape of actual AI transparency by examining machine learning documentation practices. ML documentation is, quote, a building block for responsible AI in industry practice, Liao Wortman Vaughan. We look at the practices of field leaders and the broader field. To look at field leaders, we use the Stanford Foundation Model Transparency Index, which scores top foundation model developers. These are the companies on the cutting edge of AI model development who have a lot of market power due to how concentrated the market is, and will also have the resources to devote to documentation. To look at the broader field, we look at the universe of model cards uploaded to Hugging Face, which is one of the largest platforms for sharing AI models. Here we use a study by Liang et al. Of 32,000 model cards on Hugging Face. There were two versions of the Stanford Foundation Model Transparency Index, or the SFMTI. There was version 1.0 in 2023, where researchers identified 10 major companies and scored their transparency practices based on publicly available information. And then with version 1.1 in 2024, 14 companies themselves submitted transparency reports. In both cases, companies were scored on the basis of 100 indicators that, quote, comprehensively characterize transparency for foundation model developers. The Transparency Index offers insights into labor transparency in two ways. The first is upstream indicators for transparency. The index explicitly considers transparency around data workers who annotate and curate data used in the models. The second is downstream indicators. It doesn't have a specific labor dimension, but does include overall post-deployment impacts. Data labor was the second least transparent subdomain in version 1.0. That includes the employer, wages, geographical distribution of data workers, instructions they give to them, or any other labor protections that they implement. In both version 1.0 and 1.1, developers scored the least of any subdomain on impact. No developers provide transparency on a number of the downstream indicators in both 1.0 and 1.1, affected market sectors, affected individuals, affected geographies, and usage reporting. No information was available in 1.0 on a mechanism for users to seek redress, and only 3 developers provide transparency in 1.1 on a redress mechanism. Hugging Face, their model card template does not include data labor, which itself is indicative of a gap in transparency. It may also influence the model cards that were uploaded. It does include a risk, bias, and limitation sections where, quote, socially relevant issues that the model might cause can be reported. It does have a specific section on environmental impact where a model's electricity usage and carbon emissions are reported. So the risk, bias, and limitation section was one of the least filled out sections. Only 17% of models had anything reported. Environmental impacts were the least at 2% of models reporting. It does not include a specific labor dimension, which is telling, and the lack of reporting on climate measures provides a parallel example of a lack of transparency on impact. So AI systems rely on data sets and data labor, but current transparency tools are geared towards data sets, but not data labor. Data labor and the people who form that labor are kept hidden and invisibilized. This invisibility of workers enables exploitation. Data laborers, much like domestic workers or garment workers, all labor under poor conditions because their work and their humanity are hidden from us. The picture on the bottom right is from a presentation of tech equity in a press story in the Equal Times. This picture is of Junbi and John Henry in the Philippines who work for a subsidiary of Scale AI. Ultimately, the data they are labeling is for Apple. Junbi earns about $7 for an 8 to 10 hour day. So how do we address this gap in transparency? How can we make labor visible as a beginning to making it valuable? First, we address this gap conceptually. The first is a concept developed by Liao and Wortman-Vaughan around human-centered transparency. They argue that transparency needs to be designed for different stakeholders who have different goals. These diverse stakeholders include model developers, business decision makers, regulators, end users, and impact people, and we would say workers. The second concept is from PAI's About ML reference document. Beyond the artifact itself, the process of documentation can support the goal of transparency by prompting critical thinking about the ethical implications of each step in the machine learning lifecycle. The document emphasizes transparency as a process, not just an artifact, a way to engage stakeholders in an ongoing process of asking, answering, and documenting questions about design, development, and deployment, and considering the potential impacts of various choices. I'd like to introduce a 3-pronged approach to addressing the gap in labor transparencies. Worker can be included as a topic of transparency. Workers can be included as an audience for transparency efforts, and they can actually be participants in transparency as a process. These are not mutually exclusive, but can be combined. Here are 3 examples. Workers as a topic of transparency. OpenAI's system card for GPT-4 emphasizes the potential impact on labor. It highlights the possibility of automating jobs and displacing workers rather than augmenting workers. It also goes beyond automation to discuss job quality and disparate impacts. It also offers transparency around its data labor. Its data labor practices include allowing annotators to opt out of tasks, receive market wages, and access a feedback mechanism where annotators can raise and discuss work issues. Sepsis Watch, workers as audience and participants in transparency. Sepsis Watch is a tool developed by technologists working together with frontline healthcare workers to diagnose and treat sepsis, a deadly infection. Clinical workers helped design Sepsis Watch's one-page model fact sheet to convey key information about the model to frontline workers. The artifact was based on Mitchell's model cards for model reporting and resembled a pharmaceutical drug warning label with directions for use and warnings. Workers as participants were able to shape transparency to address workers as an audience by selecting what information would be most relevant to workers about the model and how to best present it in a concise and understandable way to workers. A key aspect of the model fact sheet was how it conveyed that Sepsis Watch was a tool to support worker decision-making, not replace it. Collective bargaining agreements, workers as participants. Collective bargaining agreements are legally binding contracts which are negotiated between groups of workers organized in unions and their employers. With 1 in 3 employees in 98 countries covered under a collective bargaining agreement, bargaining represents a widespread mechanism that could help achieve greater worker transparency. The labor management partnership between healthcare unions and Kaiser Permanente, a healthcare provider, provides one of the most robust examples of shared transparency in planning. The partnership engages in joint workforce training, forecasting to study job trends and changing skills required by new technology. The partnership is also able to act on the workforce forecasting by supporting worker training and job security in response to forecasted changes. I'd like to end with some further questions. Liao and Wortman-Vaughan say that transparency and control go hand in hand. They describe how transparency without control can frustrate users or lead to false senses of agency and responsibility. Meanwhile, transparency is necessary to developing effective control. We're given examples of how to address the labor transparency gap by workers being a topic of transparency, an audience for transparency efforts, and participants in transparency. Further, Sepsis Watch and the Kaiser Labor Management Partnership offer initial examples where workers are empowered through the co-design or collective bargaining process. What are other ways workers can not only be participants in the transparency process, but also empowered in that process? At stake is the direction of technological change. According to Cohen's recent study on worker voice and generative AI, the broader the set of stakeholders involved in defining the problems and opportunities that generative AI technologies can address, the more likely it is that these tools will be used to augment how workers do their jobs rather than displace them. Ultimately, Sepsis Watch and the Kaiser Labor Management Partnership are examples that point the way to a larger question. How do we combine transparency and control so that transparency practices go beyond a checklist of artifacts into an actual process for shared governance? Thank you. I'll pass it back to you, Liza.
Thank you so much, Kang. And I'm excited now to move into the panel portion of this event. And we've selected these panelists because we think they all have really interesting perspectives on labor and transparency issues. My first question is for Elizabeth. So, Elizabeth, you co-authored a report with Madeline Claire Elish, which describes the case of Sepsis Watch that Kang touched on in his presentation. And Sepsis Watch is a healthcare machine learning system. Healthcare workers were involved throughout the implementation lifecycle of the system, from design to oversight. Why do you think other organizations implementing AI systems should do the same?
This is a great question. First, I want to thank everybody here. Thank you so much, Kong, for this really incredible report. This intersection of workers and transparency is so important, but so understudied. So I'm so glad that we're all talking about it today. Thank you so much, Eliza, for bringing us together, my co-panelists. This project of Sepsis Watch was really spearheaded by Mark Sendak and Madeline Elish, so I really want to thank them for doing this. Mark was one of the biggest stakeholders at Duke where this project happened, and he had a really progressive way of thinking about the way that workers participate in this development pipeline. And he not only involved workers in the development of the model information sheet, but throughout the development pipeline, even into post-deployment evaluation. And that was where Madeline and I came in. He brought us in to do a post-deployment evaluation and to assess how does this system actually work in practice? How is it being integrated into the organization of the emergency room at the Duke Hospital? And as a part of that, how is transparency actually working and how is it operating in situ in this place of work? And this work really shed light on how AI is integrated into the complex socio-technical ecosystem of work. So the system developers, they had worked with workers and clinicians and nurses in developing this model information sheet. And this provided all kinds of information, like Kung was saying, into like how the model worked and how it should augment work. But during our evaluation and post-deployment, we actually found a lot of complications in how people actually use this transparency and use this information in their work. And one finding that kept coming up over and over again was that as Sepsis Watch disrupted normal and traditional structures of work and routines of organization, information and the processing of information as part of these organizational routines and structures became a huge point of contention around how expertise was being disrupted. And something that nurses told us about again and again in these interviews was that they would call down to the emergency room because they called on phones. They had Sepsis Watch on an iPad. And they would call down to the physicians in the emergency room and they would say, hey, Sepsis Watch says that the patient in like pod number 2 might be septic. And the physicians did not really understand. They weren't really trained on how actually to implement this information into their workflow and into their expertise and into the process of conducting clinical expertise in the diagnosis of disease. And not only that, but the doctors were actually there with the patient. And so when they got these phone calls, they'd say, listen, I'm looking at the guy. He doesn't look septic. What do you mean Sepsis Watch says that he looks septic? I'm looking at him. His skin looks okay. His levels look okay. What is Sepsis Watch seeing that I'm not seeing? And so even though nurses had this information sheet where they could talk about like the 32 million data points that went into this recommendation production, they didn't have information about the exact local case that they were looking at. And so nurses were confronted with this organizational hurdle that they had to cross. Like, okay, this information isn't making it across this established organizational routine of expertise and of profession. And so the nurses told us that they actually came up with their own practices and how to build more transparency into the process. And one nurse told me that she, or told us rather, that she came up with her own way of kind of semi-diagnosing. And she'd say, okay, I'd say to Sepsis Watch, convince me. Am I convinced that this person has sepsis? And so they combines the Sepsis Watch recommendation with their own read on all the individual patient records. And so while Sepsis Watch came with its own information sheet and had a lot of transparency at a global level, nurses combined that with information at a local level. And it was through that combination of information that they were actually to get the diagnosis through to doctors. And they'd say, okay, I'm looking at their white blood cell count, I'm looking at their fluids, I'm looking at their response to various medications. So I actually agree with Sepsis Watch. I think this person is at risk of developing sepsis. And so that would get through to clinicians. They'd say, okay, I'll take another look. And Sepsis Watch in the end did have a substantive impact on the number of people who actually passed away from sepsis. And so the work that these nurses did, the labor that they did to build more local transparency into this process is really a call to action for organizations to engage in more robust forms of evaluation, to work much more closely with workers, to better understand how AI and the transparency around AI is actually used and how it actually functions in the very complex socio-technical ecosystem of work.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. My next question is for Iha. So much of your work examines how technology is disrupting and often transforming labor, which is often to the detriment of workers. How might the inclusion of workers in AI transparency policy generate material wins for workers rather than just a checklist exercise for industry?
Thank you so much, Eliza, for that question. And also thank you to Kung, Elizabeth, and Michelle. Very excited to be part of this conversation. First of all, I think the report is incredibly important for really encapsulating how labor and conversations about labor more broadly are excluded from discussions about ethical AI. And as one of Kung's earlier slides demonstrated, often the dialogue around how work is being disrupted is total automation. And so in this framework, we often miss out on the other ways in which technology is affecting work, and therefore really understanding what transparency can provide. So tools may not work as intended. They could break down, they could be manipulated, or even they could even create new forms of hidden work that are then not addressed when we think about the ethical concerns of this technology. And without looking at these other ways in which the technology is affected, we fail to sort of see other forms of bias, lack of accountability, interpretability, and then the power imbalances, which I'll talk to in the workplace, which also create a different other forms of ethical concerns. So it's one way that I think about the lack of data transparency and how workers are not considered in that is that it's a form of precarity. And what I mean by that is that it creates instability and a lack of predictability. And when there's this type of instability and volatility, it erodes trust in an AI or an algorithmic system. And when this happens, workers end up spending a lot of time and energy trying to figure out how to make a system work for them and creating higher levels of inefficiency for them. And this can result in workers hacking a system, gaming a system, or even finding workarounds outside of a system. So the research at Data Society has looked at primarily workers in the gig economy, but this is definitely, these mechanisms tools have definitely extended beyond those in gig. But this includes looking at the work of ride-hailing drivers, care workers, and more recently, workers who are confronting generative AI in their work. One example of how workers are trying to deal with this lack of transparency is the idea of, among drivers of not chasing the surge. So for those who have ever taken a car, oftentimes the company will say there's surge pricing, which is happening because there's a huge influx of customers at a particular location. And the surge for workers is to encourage them to travel to that location. But workers have learned to not trust the surge because it doesn't always result in a gain for them. They'll arrive at a location only to find out that there's no work. And so the next time they're inclined to not follow and to follow these surges. And in some conversations, another example is in some conversations I've had with writers, many are hesitant to use AI tools such as script analysis tools because of fears that their ideas will be stolen to train these AI systems, making these tools, which maybe could augment their work, not something that they're willing to risk taking. And I think Kang made this clear in his report when he said transparency is one of the cornerstones of safe and responsible AI, as one of the most widely cited ethical principles. And more explicitly, transparency is important to trustworthy and safe systems. So when these systems don't take into consideration the challenges that workers face beyond total disruption, they will not use an AI system if it's considered untrustworthy or unsafe. And this points to sort of really there are several benefits to including workers in the conversation or AI transparency. And one of those is transparency can reveal the power dynamics at play. As Kang rightly mentions, there's a balance between transparency and control, and greater information allows for greater control in the hands of the workers. As the surge example demonstrates, workers are either hesitant to participate or take a gamble, driving out of their way to chase something that's not guaranteed. So workers often express a desire for more information, which would give them greater control over their conditions of work. Related, transparency also allows us to ask about how risk is being assigned. More recently, conversations about AI have talked about existential risks. You know, is human extinction about nigh? But there are more common risks that are not fully explored, and excluding the challenges faced by workers in developing more ethical AI, we're missing out on opportunities to understand those risks. Our research on delivery workers, for example, found that workers face physical dangers on their job and have few protections while they're out driving. Delivery platform GPS may be wrong, fail to take into account factors like roadblocks, private property where people may have firearms or even dangerous animals. And so workers are a disadvantage in the employment relationship and might go anyway, because if they fail to do so, they could be automatically deactivated or demoted through the platforms. So this begs the question, is it ethically fair to ask a worker to decide between making a living and being safe? And in the example of writers, do writers in theory use this tool that could make them be more efficient or potentially be part of automating their job entirely? So I will just end that, as the report mentions, managing risk is also a goal and objective of responsible AI systems. So where there isn't sufficient transparency or risk isn't clearly assigned or visible to those who are experiencing it, then that is a gap in reaching those goals.
Thank you so much, Iha. Okay, we're going to move to Michelle. So, through your role at the Harvard Center for Labor and a Just Economy, you engage with unions grappling with the effects of AI on workers. How can union collective bargaining around technology offer a model for participatory processes that we can integrate into transparency efforts?
Thank you, Eliza. And thank you, Kang, for this incredible research. I find the Sepsis Watch case study in particular to be a real beacon of hope in terms of thinking about how we are both utilizing technology to address the real concrete problems and also building out a way for workers to demonstrate their own expertise and agency. So I just think that's a great starting point. When I think about what a collective bargaining agreement represents, I really think of it as representing a process, a joint process of prioritization between workers and management, and a structure for decision making around that prioritization. So I really appreciate the description of transparency also as a process. I think those two actually go quite nicely together. Because often in a collective bargaining process, in the negotiation period of creating a collective bargaining agreement, you have a group of workers and their union who are coming to the table with a list of things that they would like to address through the agreement with the employer, and the employer coming with the list of things that they think they would like to prioritize. And the negotiation is, which thing are we going to prioritize? And what we have seen in efforts, I study specifically non-union clerical workers who are sort of at the front edge of a lot of experimentation with off-the-shelf AI models being integrated into their workflows. And what we see in that context is that things just kind of show up one day with not a lot of explanation, and people are expected to use them. And often the decision to integrate that technology into a workflow was made by someone in the IT office or maybe someone in HR who doesn't have a real grasp or sense of like what the actual workflow is. And so those workers haven't been able to say, I would like to actually adjust how I'm doing this part of my job. And could we experiment with AI in that part of my job and see if it's something that could be workable or create greater efficiency? Instead, it's thrust upon them, and kind of to Iha's point, the response is resentment, frustration, and kind of ad hoc, individualized problem solving and solution. So that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the employer that's trying to figure out how to best use the technology, because there's not a process for learning about like how workers are actually using or avoiding using the tech. And there's no way for people to be able to talk about where there are inefficiencies in their workflows that could be solved with artificial intelligence. So what you see in a collective bargaining process is an opportunity for the employer and the workers to look at the overall flow and process of the work that they're doing, to identify inefficiencies, to identify places where things could actually be functioning a lot better, and to come to an agreement about how technology might be integrated into those processes. And then I think an opportunity to come into agreement about what technology is actually used. So this also comes back to what we're learning about in terms of like, do we want to use technology that has a lot of documentation and transparency in the way that it's been developed, so that helps the workers and employers make decisions about the best and most responsible AI being integrated into their processes. So, and I also think that what the collective bargaining structure does is it creates accountability in that process. So this is not a handshake agreement. This is, we have asked for something, you have agreed to it, and there are consequences if the employer ultimately dishonors the agreement that has been made, which happens through the withholding of labor or other ways in which unions are able to ensure that employers are held accountable. I think that specifically in contexts where, like in hospitals and the public sector and education and other places where a lot of people could be negatively impacted if technology or AI is like shoved into a process or rushed through, it is very important for workers to be able to be the ones on the front line that are able to say, like, hold on, we're not going to do this in this way. We're seeing harm and we're going to stop the process. And I don't even think, based on a lot of what I hear, I don't always hear that when that things like that happen, it's due to malice from the employer so much as a rush to just deploy something. And so building in these multiple processes through collective bargaining and negotiation on a regular basis and structures for workers to do this work of prioritization and decision making actually benefits both like impacted parties that are being served by the workers and the employer's ability to more thoughtfully integrate technology overall.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that answer. Finally, Kung, I want to ask you a question. Your report makes a powerful case for companies to include workers as both participants and audiences in AI transparency efforts. What do you see as one key barrier to achieving this goal right now in our current moment, and how might we overcome it?
So I think there's some very obvious and practical, kind of the quintessential challenges is time and resources, right? There are a lot of pressures to produce, to deploy quickly, to produce quickly. And, in some ways, and kind of reorient this question, we're not quite trying to overcome it, right? And that's because it will take time and it will take resources. And that's not a shortcut or an easy answer to that, but there's going to be like a reorientation where you actively value inclusion by putting time and resources into it, and then see that less as an obstacle and more as an investment. So MIT professor Thomas Cohan has a body of work in different industries that shows that when you do include workers in the process of development and deployment, sort of what like Michelle had alluded to already, you end up actually with better products, you end up with better implementation, and you ended up with better jobs, right? This is an investment on the front end with a payoff on the long term, right? And to give an example, the Kaiser Labor Management Partnership was a major investment when it was started, and it was started in the mid-90s during a time that Kaiser was actually in a fiscal deficit, but it made this decision to invest for the long term. And in the early 2000s, the Labor Management Partnership was key to the success of a massive rollout of technology, of electronic health records. And that was a $4 billion undertaking and super complicated across hundreds of thousands of people, right? So in that labor management partnership, there was guaranteed job security for all workers. There was retraining for workers who needed new skills. And overall, for everybody, including the employer, there was a smoother transition. And that was thanks to that front-end investment in the labor management partnership. I think I want to end on another more conceptual idea too, is that when we produce something, there are actually two things being produced. The product itself, right? But we ourselves are also being produced in that process. We are being shaped by that process of production. So we also have to consider when we produce something, are we also producing a more participatory society? Are we producing a more democratic one? And I think that's why it's worth it.
Thank you so much, Kang. I want to end with a question for each of the panelists. What is giving you hope right now, or what is a win you're celebrating in your world of work? Maybe we'll start with Elizabeth and go in order with who spoke.
Yeah, I love this as a outgoing question because it's these are tough times. I think we're all cognizant that there have been some real losses for workers and for civil society and for human rights and for the environment. But what gives me hope is this is going to be very corny, but the old the Mr. Rogers encouragement to look for the people helping. There's always people helping. And being in a group like this, on a panel like this, and hearing about the incredible work that the people here are doing, thinking about everyone who's attending today, thinking about how much attention this issue is getting and how real conversations are happening about how work is being impacted and what we as a society at a high level ought to do and what work means, as well as at a granular level on what can we actually fix. I'm really heartened by everyone who is participating in these conversations and working together to build a better tomorrow.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Iha.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Elizabeth, for starting that off. I was sort of struggling with this, rightfully. I think what I've seen in my work that gives me hope is that there are workers really kind of recognizing that they're in a very similar situation across sectors, across industries, across class. And some of them are really clawing back what it means to do the work that they do and finding real value in the work that, you know, machines and others would claim as unvaluable or easily automatable. And I think that that's it's creating, I guess, a culture shift and maybe even a class consciousness that maybe we haven't seen in a little while. So that's giving me a little bit of hope and positivity in this moment.
Michelle?
Thank you both. I have a specific example, and then a general example. I think that Josh dropped a link to it in the chat, but in Pennsylvania, the governor of the state was very eager to integrate artificial intelligence and OpenAI into state operations. And the Union 668, SEIU Local 668, which represents public sector workers, the people who actually do the work of benefits provisions and benefits assistance in the state, reached an agreement to create like a worker board that will oversee the implementation of AI and make decisions about where AI shows up in workflows, and really seeing themselves as the people who are in the role to ensure that people who receive benefits from the state are not harmed by a sloppy rollout of technology, but that it really has the potential to benefit people. And to Elizabeth's point about what a difficult situation we find ourselves in, the benefits assistance is not going to get easier in the next couple of years. People are working in deep austerity and with ever more limited resources due to the reconciliation bill, and there are two ways that could go. That could go the way of just trying to automate everything kind of sloppily and quickly and cheaply, or it could go in the way that I hope and think it might go in PA, which is really having workers as part of the process to look at the dire situation that people are in and really make smart decisions about how they might be able to responsibly introduce efficiency into the system. And just more broadly, something that gives me hope is that in a context where it would be very easily to become nihilistic, I do not hear that from workers at all in any of the research that I've been doing. I still hear people grappling not just with what's happening inside of their workplaces, but really the human impact and spiritual impact and implications of this technology. And I remain heartened that people are so interested in finding the human in one another every day and in the value of cognition and care and all of these things that kind of make us human beings. And we haven't lost that. And I think that is really important for our future.
Thank you, Michelle. And Kung, we'll end with you.
Thanks. That was really beautiful, Michelle. And also shout out to you for your active work in making that SEIU deal. And, it definitely is an inspiration. Um, this is a tough question. It's tough times. And so the thing I keep thinking about is this quote by abolitionist Mariam Kaba. And what she says is, hope is a discipline. So hope isn't just like a warm feeling you get, but it's something that actually takes work and intention and practice. And so I feel like hope is a discipline is a really good antidote in this field because we get overwhelmed by the message that the path that technological change is taking is inevitable, right? And somehow that automation, complete job apocalypse is the inevitable end that we're all facing, and that we can only talk about how to pick up the pieces afterwards, right? And that's just how it is. So I think hope is a discipline really changes that orientation, and you have to put effort into hope. You have to make the decision to go and keep struggling every day and keep working towards change. And then you have to take action and have this belief that the future is really still in the making. And that's what I believe is, hope is a discipline.
Thank you so much, Kang, and thanks to all of you. It was a really beautiful place to end this panel discussion. We're going to move now into audience Q&A. So if you have a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and you can type in a question there, but also feel free to put it in the chat and I'll voice it over for our panelists. So our first question, and this is posed to the whole group, as algorithmic models have different versions and change often, and thus the model card is changing, how sustainable is it to have model cards as documentation? Whoever wants to start with that.
I'd be happy to kick us off if that's okay if I jump
Yeah,
in.
thank you.
I really liked kind of like the quotations that you had, I think from the Lau and Wortman Bond about how creating transparency is an opportunity for reflection. And I do a lot of work with development teams in coaxing them to fill out the model card and fill it out to the best of their ability and calibrate what is feasible to do within the capacities and within the timelines and constraints of their team, and what is needed in terms of communicating to our partners, communicating to our customers. And this, just the process of writing something down, it really is an opportunity for reflection because there's so many components of a model card, particularly around bias testing, that development teams don't always get an opportunity to make time for in their normative development pipelines. And so just asking them to just write this down, do some testing. Like it doesn't have to be incredibly exorbitant, even if you don't have the capacity to do that, but just get started. And so building these habits is, I feel, the most important part to getting started. So I do agree that we're seeing a lot of churn with new models are coming out constantly. There's thousands of models on the shelf. So dev teams can and do not only use new models, but also fine tune and retrain and optimize. But getting started, getting that habit going of, okay, we're going to fill out a model card and here's how you do it. I do believe that practice of getting started brings some sustainability to the process.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Do others have thoughts on model cards, transparency, and workers? Okay. If not, then we can move on to our next question. Um, do you see opportunities for including workers in AI transparency efforts via public policy? And I know where most of us on the panel are coming from a US context, but I assume this question can be answered more broadly than that. Anyone like to take that one?
Well, I do think that there can be transparency requirements through procurement. And so that's like a huge area where we have a lot of leverage actually, because, governments are major consumers of technology. And so by using the process of procurement at all levels, including to the local level, is a way to make a big difference and encourage transparency and encourage consideration of workers.
I just want to add to that I think we're all in the US context, but I know in certain parts of Europe, workers are less concerned about the impacts of technology and automation because they have a social safety net. And so really the two go hand in hand. You know, the impacts of technology are really meant in some cases to benefit a broader society. But that means public policy and those who are regulating our society need to be part of the conversation. So I absolutely think that that is a real opportunity to advance how everyone lives and not just simply how a tool is used and its impact.
Thank you so much for that, both Kung and Iha. And I also want to plug PAI's guidelines for AI and shared prosperity, which Iha actually contributed to on our steering committee. And these guidelines are really comprehensive in thinking about how to ensure workers actually benefit from technology from every vantage point, and that includes policymakers, it includes organized labor, and it includes AI developing and AI using organizations. So all of those parties have a role to play. And I will make sure to link those in the chat. Another question from Tim Newman, who says, congrats, Kung, on the paper. And thank you to the panelists. Do you see transparency efforts as an effective way to also provide mechanisms for workers in similar roles across national boundaries who are often separated from each other deliberately to connect together and share mutual concerns and build solidarity? Anyone like to kick us off with that?
Well, I see all of us nodding in response to the question. We're like, absolutely, bring it, international solidarity. What first comes to mind is data workers, of course, and the ways that people are sort of atomized and split across many, many different countries. But I think another example, which I think is inspiring for questions of transparency, is sort of the whole sweatshop labor movement around garment workers. And similarly, there was this group called Workers' Rights Consortium that was their focus, was to bring transparency to all the like sub-hidden like manufacturing that was happening and what the conditions of workers were. So I think there is a lot of example both historically and currently, and that is still a current struggle, I think, to get transparency beyond like what's behind the label, right?
But maybe if I could just piggyback really quickly on that, I think the distinction between who's a data worker and who's not a data worker, who's providing the data and whose data is being used and who's using the technology is really, it's really those boundaries are being broken down. And so it isn't necessarily two different efforts. There really are very similar efforts and similar impacts across borders, across, occupation. And so I think that there are definitely opportunities to build that and that transparency about who is being building the tool and who is using the tool is really an important one to ask and to make clear for everyone.
Thank you. Our next question. I want my company to better include workers in our transparency efforts, but I don't know how to convince our leadership that this is important. Is there a way I can make this case? And I think, Kung, I heard you touch on some of this in your presentation, not to put you on the spot, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Well, if you want like to shove reports at people, Kohan is a good place to start because he has a whole body of work. And I actually really like, and there's also another body of work that he's building on top of, which is looking at manufacturing in Japan. And one of the words that they use, this like phrase, which I think is really compelling, is it's that workers who give wisdom to the machines. And that's the process of technological development that sort of is like, needs to be more seen. So there's that body of work. There's Virginia Dolgast, and she also does a body of work around call center workers and has this in-depth like case study of Deutsche Telekom and how they integrated workers into their processes. And it ended up being, like better customer service, more resolution of of calls to the call center. So there's a lot of work out there, I think, that shows and demonstrates that this is a win-win potentially for everyone.
Thank you so much, Kung. And also want to draw attention in the chat. Josh just dropped a link to our partner Tech Equity Collaborative's new resource where they're starting to map the data enrichment supply chain. And I really encourage everyone to check that out. It's really relevant to the previous question. Did anyone want to add? Sorry to jump in. I don't know. Yes, Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, I would love, sorry, Michelle, I just saw that you also unmuted. Thank you. I immediately typed workers giving wisdom to the machine. That's just it's so apt and it's so accurate. And I'm gonna add that to my toolkit. Convincing leadership that responsible AI is in their best interest is my bread and butter. It's something I try to get better at every day. There are a lot of different ways to persuade, to do this work of persuasion. Kung, I think you already touched on one of improving services and improving products. Bringing workers in as beta testers, as proto users, as providing that early stage wisdom on what people actually need is so incredibly valuable. And not just that, but workers are already in your own company. They already work for you. That is a value that would be left on the table if they weren't consulted about the things that they're building. I also try to do some like definitional and rhetorical persuasion of saying that, okay, there's a lot of different ways that we can define a good product. Some of these are around accuracy, some are around performance. The dimensions of what we call responsible AI needs to be part of that definition and part of that calculus of how we talk about a good product. And I use a lot of metaphors for this. One that seems to work particularly well across different kinds of crowds with different kinds of expertise is calling on the automotive example and telling developers that they have built an amazing car, goes so fast, 0 to 60 is immediate, there's so much horsepower, but no one's going to get in it if there aren't any seatbelts. I want to make sure that people can get into it because we're not building a car to sit in a parking lot, we're building a car to be driven. And in order to do that, we're going to need seatbelts and we're going to need airbags. People are so accustomed to benefiting from the decades of work and safety testing and the normative claims of safety testing that have gone into the automotive industry that this is a really nice, they can see it every day. Like, oh, of course, cars need a seatbelt. And so doing some of this rhetorical work to ensure that leadership knows that this is already in their best interest, whether that is how we define a good product, how we leverage the value and the wisdom that is already extant in our workforce. There's a lot of persuasion also around customer and shareholder relations. We constantly have customers asking, what are you doing about responsible AI? And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to make this argument. Some are going to work better than others. It's worth trying out different approaches, but it can be done and it needs to be done.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Michelle, did you have something you want to add? No, you're good. Okay. Another question. How do you think about the differences between transparency and communications?
I can take that.
Yeah.
I'm probably just going to riff on it though. I think it's a really good question, and my gut instinct is that the difference is that transparency is about an exchange and a process of sharing and accountability, and communications is often like one way. Um, is we're going to share out the thing that we're doing, and here's the information about it. And so, and there are contexts in which communications make sense, but in the context that we're talking about, I think that it's power, that in control, that in transparency you are creating opportunities for power sharing and shared control. And in communications, you're kind of telling people what's up, but they don't really have an ability to shape it or react to it in a sufficient way.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful. Anyone else have anything they'd like to add before we close out?
I just want to personally thank this panelists who are like all rock stars that I look up to, and I really appreciate all of you being here with me. And it gives me that Mr. Rogers vibe. We're here to help. Like I'm surrounded by other people who are here to help.
I feel the same way. Thank you so much to all of you. And I feel like I'm leaving with the feeling that, we're part of this long history of working people struggling to protect the meaning of our working lives. And it gives me a lot of hope that I'm in that struggle with all of you. And also, I'll be taking from this conversation that really the call to think about responsible AI much more broadly, and whether that's a social safety net, or protections for worker organizing, or transparency that includes workers throughout the process. Yeah, thank you so much.